for joining me. It is always a pleasure having you here. I know
Thank you.
narcissism and attachment theory is, um, can I use the word adrenaline rush for you? You love talking about this
Yes.
and I love hearing you talk about it. So thank you for agreeing to have this discussion with me on it.
Well, thanks for
For
having me.
those of us who don't know you or know of your work, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do.
Well, I'm Ryan Holley. I go by Coach Ryan on social media. I work with people to help build and form healthy relationships, set boundaries, and also understand themselves as well as their partners. And I do tend to specialize in attachment, but I also have a pretty decent understanding of personality or disorder issues as well, especially cluster B, which includes narcissism, which often gets confused for insecure attachment. But it really is not the same thing at all. And the goal here is to help clear up a lot of the misunderstandings about personality disorders and insecure attachment.
It's interesting because you are really at the intersection of two personalities that's kind of creating a lot of pain and havoc, especially the misunderstanding of these two, which is narcissism and those with an avoidant attachment style. What is one of the most damaging myths that you've had to deal with or you've encountered that you had to sort of debunk for yourself when it comes to the work that you do?
Well, the one of the biggest myths that's a misunderstanding is that anybody that shows insecure behavior in a relationship is a narcissist. And and that can be hurtful because one is very judgmental, it's condemning, and it's also assuming the intent. And intent is actually a really important thing here, and also the ability and prospects of healing too. A person with insecure attachment, regardless the attachment style, whether it's avoidant, anxious, disorganized, these are people that can heal and become secure because attachment is a learned behavior. Yes, it's learned based on insecurities, but those insecurities can be healed and new behaviors can be learned. Insecure attachment is not all encompassing of who you are as a person, is what you learn to do. Now, narcissism, now I'm talking about the personality disorder here. I'm not talking, everybody has narcissistic traits, right? We all have moments where we are selfish and prioritize ourselves. But I'm talking about the full blown personality disorder. It doesn't go away. Are there rare instances where a person can learn to manage it? Yes. Is that expected? No. Narcissism is something that is there and it's also more malignant too. Whereas an insecurely attached person, they don't mean to hurt. That's not their goal. They don't take pleasure in hurting their partner. Now, due to their own insecurities, they can become hyper focused on themselves and fail to consider the emotional impact that their behavior has on their partner, but they're not doing it for the goal of hurting their partner. Whereas a narcissist, a true narcissist, does. Seeing you in pain actually makes them feel powerful. So there's a big difference in intent, a big difference in the ability to heal, and being labeled as a narcissist, if you're truly just an insecure person, that is, especially if you're trying to grow and heal and learn to do better behaviors, it can feel, very shame-inducing, and feed into the already pre-existing wounds that the person already has.
All right, and you mentioned malignant narcissism. There are many types of
Mhm.
narcissism, which can be easily confused. Can you list a few of the types of narcissism?
Well, there's multiple different types. I mean, you have the malignant narcissist, which is the most common, unfortunately. But malignant narcissist is the one that intends to hurt and cause pain. They're the ones that unfortunately get most of the spotlight. Now, there are benign narcissists who are just as grandiose on the inside and have an inflated sense of self, but they don't get pleasure out of hurting others. You have grandiose narcissists, which is the more overt narcissist that you think of, the person that brags more, the person that is really more overt with their selfishness and their narcissism. You have covert narcissists, which really tend to try to mask their narcissism through fake humility, humbleness. They love to embrace the victim role. You have vulnerable narcissists. I mean, there's a lot of different types of narcissists, but if you want to break it down into overall broader categories, you tend to have grandiose and covert and subcategories within. And then you have malignant and non-malignant. And unfortunately, when you're dealing with somebody who is full-blown narcissist, you're far more likely to encounter a malignant one than a non-malignant.
All right, and what's the difference between the covert narcissist and those benign? Is that what you mentioned?
Well, covert narcissists can be just as malignant, right? They can be just as malignant as an overt grandiose. They just have learned to mask their narcissism through fake humbleness, humility. They've learned to embrace the victim role rather than the I'm superior role. They love to be the victim, and they'll paint themselves as the victim when they're not. Now, anybody can be truly victimized in their life, but the covert narcissist really embellishes it and embraces it and thrives in the victim role in a way that a normal person wouldn't. But they can be just as malicious and enjoy inflicting pain just as much as their overt, grandiose counterpart. Now, the benign narcissist, they are still a person that can be very egotistical, but they don't actually seek to actually hurt another person. That's not how they get their narcissistic supply. Narcissistic supply is the attention, the validation, adoration, power, and control that a narcissistic person feels entitled to. And when it really, and this is one of the biggest differences between a person that is a malignant versus a non-malignant, malignant, also known as benign, is the power and control element. The malignant narcissist thrives on power and control. They need to be in control of you. They need to be in the power position. And hurting you, causing pain, seeing you give an emotional reaction, it to them means that they have power over you, that they are relevant, that they can control you. Look, I can hurt this person. I'm powerful. Whereas the non-malignant narcissist does not seek the power and control in the way that a malignant narcissist does. They love the praise, they love the attention, they love the spotlight, they love to be adored, but they don't necessarily get enjoyment from hurting another person. And that is really the biggest difference between the two.
All right, now I'm jumping the gun here. What happens when a person with a benign narcissistic personality trait, what happens when they don't get that validation? They don't get that or feel like they're in control?
When they don't feel like they're in control, or when they don't get that validation, they'll tend to seek it elsewhere. That's just what they tend to do. That could be leaving a relationship, straying from a relationship, going out and seeking validation on social media, the internet, looking for the likes, maybe bragging extra to try to get the attention back on them. They definitely will try to find the limelight. I mean, they thrive in it.
All right, now we've heard stories where, you know, clients have reported or people have reported that their avoidant attached partner will do that, look for validation elsewhere. How can a person tell what's the difference between which is the avoidant attached and which one has a narcissistic personality trait?
So, insecure people in general, and by the way, this includes anxious attachers, can be prone to seeking validation from other people in sometimes very shallow ways because you're looking for someone else to confirm, look, you are great, look, you are wonderful. And that soothes the insecurity temporarily, but not in a meaningful way. So that is not unique just to avoidance. I just want to put that out there. But yes, an avoidant attacher can go online, post a selfie for some likes to get some validation and do things like that. So, but so can a narcissistic person. Now that said, it can be very confusing to tell if you are dealing with somebody who is simply insecure versus somebody who's a narcissist. The evidence tends to creep through with the amount of cruelty and coldness. Person who is simply avoidant attached generally does not behave in a way that is overtly cruel, overtly cold. You can tell when the narcissistic person is really trying to hurt you, when they're really trying to twist the knife in. It's not just about them getting validation, it's about seeing you suffer. They'll say things that are just very, very nasty, very cutting. An avoidant attacher generally does not like conflict. They generally run from it. It is one of their triggers. Narcissistic people, however, tend to embrace conflict. They tend to cause the conflict. Now, they can give the silent treatment, which is often confused for stonewalling. Stonewalling is something that an avoidant attached person would often do because they're overwhelmed with anxiety and their brain is essentially shutting down to where they can't even think straight. So they take space to soothe and regulate themselves. The silent treatment is different. This is not a person that's overwhelmed with anxiety. This is a person that's punishing you by not talking to you and watching you squirm to try to get power and control. The intent is different. The silent treatment is more of a narcissistic thing. Stonewalling is more of an avoidant thing. Obviously, a person that's not a narcissist can do something like the silent treatment too, but again, intention really seeps through over time when you're dealing with this person. It starts to become pretty darn apparent that they're not just dealing with their own insecurities, they're trying to inflict pain on you. And that is really a big sign that you're dealing with somebody who is narcissistic, not just simply avoidant attached.
Okay, well, let's say someone's in this relationship. They're emotionally invested, emotionally overwhelmed. They don't have that calm to pull back and look at this objectively the way we're talking about it right now. And yes, we're making sense of what the avoidant attached person feels. They're afraid of engulfment. They don't like conflict. They'll pull away. Someone with a narcissistic personality will probably pull away as a form of punishment. How does their partner, the person in the relationship, the person who's hurting, the person who is feeling like, they're being stonewalled, there's gaslighting, there's breadcrumbing, all of these things. How can they tell which is which? Is it in a
Some,
way that they come back to the conversation, how they come back, when they come back?
Sometimes in the moment, there really is no surefire way to know. And that's the reality of it. Often throughout the course of time, if you're able to look at it through a lucid lens, yeah, you can see what you're dealing with. But when you're in the middle of it, it can be really hard to tell, especially when your own anxiety and emotions are running high. So in those cases, I think a good thing to do is take a step back, take a deep breath, and ask yourself, does the label really matter at this moment here? Because if you're on the receiving end of behaviors that don't work for you, it could be gaslighting, it could be this person's not communicating, pulling away, saying cruel things. At the end of the day, it doesn't really at that moment matter what the intent is. It doesn't. It doesn't really matter the label. You just know you're being treated in a way that doesn't work for you, which is why in that moment, all you can really do is set boundaries. That's all you can really do. Because having that label in your head isn't going to suddenly magically fix this person. But what you can do is protect yourself by just asserting your limits of what works for you and what doesn't.
I absolutely love that. Now, many times that decision, or we grapple with making that decision way into the relationship. What can a person do, or what can they look for, let's say, in the first 3 dates that would let them know that, okay, I'm probably dating someone who's got an avoidant attachment style here or a narcissistic personality disorder, keeping in mind especially the covert narcissist, which can be easily seen as somebody who is confident but also vulnerable because they do share. There's that victim mindset with a covert narcissist. So how can a person tell what they're really getting into if
It
there's
can be
signs
hard.
there? Mm-hmm.
It can be hard. I mean, sometimes those signs can be well masked. Sometimes they're not. I mean, easy one, especially if you're dealing with a more narcissistic person, but sometimes avoidant attachers can be prone to this too, is see if this person is actually interested in hearing about you and listening to you, or are they just talking about themselves? That's a very big giveaway. Another one is actually a question that you can ask a person. And this question can be very revealing about the inner workings of this person before you get too attached. It's a simple question, and it's a multi-part question. What does your past relationship history look like? Why did your past relationships fail? What did you learn from them and how did you heal? A person that is more self-reflective, introspective, is going to have specific answers for you, even if they got into a toxic relationship, right, where they were not responsible for the toxicity of their ex. There's still a lesson to be learned. It might be, I needed to learn to hold boundaries. I needed to learn to communicate about my feelings. I needed to learn to communicate more respectfully. There's always something. But a person, especially if they're more narcissistic, they are not going to have learned anything from the failures of their past relationships. And it will generally become pretty obvious through their answers. Is it foolproof? No, nothing is foolproof, but it's a pretty good question to ask. If you're met with vagueness, like, oh, we just drifted apart, or oh, this just wasn't the right one, that doesn't sound like a lesson that the person learned. Or even worse, if they're more narcissistic, they're very likely to say something like, all my exes are crazy, they're all terrible, things along those kind of lines. But be pretty obvious that this person really didn't learn any lessons from their past relationship failure. And if they didn't learn any lessons from the past failure, that means they're carrying the same issues into the next relationship. This is a person that is showing you that they don't really necessarily learn from their mistakes. And is that necessarily the foundation of a good partner? That's a question to ask yourself, but it's pretty good at detecting long-term emotional unavailability.
So what would be the difference between, or how can you tell an evolving and a self-aware an avoidant attached style person? What's the difference between the dismissive avoidant and a fearful avoidant, and how can you tell which is someone, which is the one that's more introspective or the one who is more self-aware, and not to get that confused?
Well, a person that's dismissive avoidant is more likely to give vague answers when it comes to their relationship history. They're more likely to be, oh, it just wasn't a match. She just wasn't the right one, or he just wasn't the right one. Things along those kind of lines. Oh, we just drifted apart. Vague answers that really don't pinpoint why the relationship failed to begin with. A person that's more self-aware is going to give answers that indicate that. Like, well, I realized that I wasn't emotionally present in the relationship. I didn't communicate my needs, things along those kind of lines. They might even bring up the fact that they're aware of attachment and they're trying to work on becoming more secure. A self-aware person is going to, at the very least, regardless of their attachment style, they're going to take some ownership in why the last relationship failed. It doesn't mean they're taking the blame for their ex's behavior. You're only responsible for yourself, but they'll show in some way, shape, and form that they're trying to learn from their mistakes. A person that's not self-aware, regardless of fearful avoidant, dismissive avoidant, or anxious attacher for that matter, they're not gonna give those specifics as to what they learned from it. They're going to try to paint their ex as maybe the problem, or just give very vague answers and try to brush it and move on to the next topic. That's generally what's going to happen because there's no lessons that have been learned. And a big red flag really is when they do nothing but trash their exes, regardless of attachment style, regardless of narcissism. If all they do is trash their exes and they don't take any accountability on their end, well, rest assured, when things break down between the two of you, they're going to do the same to you as well.
Yeah, I remember learning that in my 20s. If someone says mean things about someone else to you, chances are high they'll do the same thing. And what did you do in that relationship that might have provoked them possibly to that sort of behavior? Not to say that they might not have been with someone who was a narcissist and that person was, but like you said, to take accountability and responsibility and look at how that particular experience might have helped you to grow is incredibly, incredibly important. We touched a little bit on the anxious attachment, and you started our conversation here by mentioning insecure attachment styles. Now, across our work, our platforms, we see a lot of people believe that the insecure attachment is more labeled for those with an avoidant attachment style or narcissist. Tell us how the anxious attached person shows up as insecure in relationships.
Anxious attached person obviously depends on the degree. Same thing with avoidant attached. Not all avoidant attachers are the same degree of avoidance, and same thing with anxious. Not all of them are the same degree of anxiety. But a person that is anxious attached, they are going to often seek a lot of reassurance from their partner, often reading into things that are not really there, getting, nitpicking words, trying to seek reassurance by nitpicking words, sometimes even going so far as to do behaviors that are boundary violating, like snooping through someone's phone, things like that. Sifting through social media, trying to find any inconsistencies, becoming hyper vigilant, looking for any inconsistencies in this person, and trying to seek reassurance based off of it. But seeking reassurance is the core of anxious attachment because they're not able to necessarily reassure themselves inside, so they rely on their partner to reassure them and regulate them.
All right. And how is it that their behavior, like we know the avoidant attached person, when they pull away and they need to self soothe, that causes pain for the anxious attached. And it might be confusing for a secure attached who doesn't quite understand it. But how is it that the anxious attached person's unhealed wound, their behaviors, how is that causing pain in the relationship? And how is that affecting someone who's got an avoidant attachment style?
Well, it can be smothering. They're not considering the need for someone's autonomy or personal space or how they regulate themselves. They are often, because they're so hyper focused on soothing their own abandonment wound, which is why they often seek extra reassurance and they don't like the space. They need the constant closeness to feel regulated. They're not actually empathizing with the need of the other person who maybe wants a balance of closeness and space. It doesn't always even have to be an avoidant attached person. It could be someone who's secure that likes that balance between independence and closeness that can feel smothered by somebody who's overly anxious that doesn't give them any breathing room because they're not considering that person's needs. The more insecure a person is in general, regardless of attachment style, the more hyper focused they tend to become on their own needs, their own anxieties, their own wounds, and the less they consider the actual impact of their behaviors on the other person because they're so self focused on soothing that wound.
Why do you think that avoidant attached are demonized? It's like it's always I'm hearing a lot of they are, and you're getting this. I'm an anxious attached person. My partner is this evil person. Why? Why is it that we're not hearing enough about the need for an anxious attached person to work on their insecurities as well? And as you know, I've shared this with you in the past. Um, I am from that anxious attached style. And now I'm able to look into my past and how my behavior affected the people in my life. And I'm not just talking about partners, I'm talking about everyone, friends and family members. It was a lot. I would get passive aggressive when I felt like they were not showing up for my needs. I just did not know how to communicate. I knew how to talk. There were a lot of words coming out, but I did not know how to communicate. So, two things I want to ask you. How is it affecting the relationships? What can the anxious attached person do in order to become a little bit more self aware and perhaps attuned to others, the needs of others?
Well, for the anxious attached person, it is going to take the ability to self-soothe, to self-regulate. And sometimes that does mean for the anxious attached person not being in a relationship for a bit and really learning to be okay and comfortable in your own skin. Learn to do affirmations for yourself, to actually affirm yourself, to validate yourself, to do actions that take care of yourself in your daily life without having to necessarily rely on somebody else to feel okay about yourself, to learn to be comfortable in your own skin. And when you're able to get to that point, you're not going to feel as much anxiety because you're not necessarily relying on another person to regulate you. So it's easier to consider the needs of another person when you're not relying on them to regulate you. Now, everybody likes to be validated. Everybody wants to be appreciated in a relationship, even a securely attached person. And a securely attached person will occasionally feel some anxiety if there's a conflict or things like that. That's normal human stuff. But at the end of the day, you should have the tools and your tool belt to, regulate yourself and not completely rely on another person to do so. Now, that said, I think the reason why avoidant attachers tend to get more demonized is because they are less likely to work on themselves in general because of avoiding. That's what they do. They avoid. They don't generally face issues. They've learned to avoid them. It goes back to their childhood, and that often includes introspection, self-reflection. It is a little harder for them than it is for an anxious attacher. An anxious attacher is generally more likely to look within. Obviously, there's exceptions. An anxious attacher often blames themselves for things that aren't even their fault, but they generally are willing to have a conversation. They're willing to look within, whereas the avoidant attached person is much less willing to have that conversation, to make changes, to show up to therapy and things like that. Many do, don't misunderstand, but it is a lot harder for them to make that 180-degree turn towards secure attachment than it is for an anxious attacher. If you look at people that have healed from an insecure attachment to become secure, you're going to find a lot more formerly anxious attachers that became secure than avoidant attachers. They can do it, But their programming is to avoid that kind of stuff. And the human mind learns in repetition. The more you repeat anything, the more automatic it becomes. So when your instinct, your reflex is to not deal with the problem, it becomes very hard to go against that lifetime of programming to actually start dealing with stuff in ways that you've always avoided.
Now, I'm going to be devil's advocate here. Let me ask a question on this particular thing. We know that an avoidant attached person may have a harder time going into therapy, seeking the help they need, especially at a particular age. We found that those below the age of 40 will have a harder time, accepting responsibility and looking inwards to change. Above 40, they start to see that there's a pattern here. They may not want to continue, and they get the help. We've noticed that. However, is it possible that the avoidant attached, we know they don't like conflict within self as well,
Mhm.
possible that they're not going to therapy, perhaps because they're ashamed, they don't want to look at their past behavior, take that responsibility. It's a heavy load for them. They don't want to dig up the past. They, of course, want to avoid all the pain possible. And that the anxious attached, generally, without that need to learn to love self and set boundaries for self, is it possible that they're going to therapy with the hope that they could find a remedy or the tools so that they could be better in their relationship and not necessarily for themselves? What is the
Absolutely.
difference? Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's absolutely often the case. And sometimes people go into therapy to try to get the therapist to validate you rather than actually learn the tools that you need to become a more healthy, secure person. And that, if you're looking for the therapist to just validate you, well, you're not going to learn much either. And that can be applicable for anxious or avoidant. But that said, the anxious person can be so hyper focused on getting the relationship to where they want it to be, meaning let this person validate and regulate me, that they're not actually learning the tools to regulate and validate themselves. So absolutely that can sometimes be the case. For the for the avoidant attached person, you mentioned the shame. That core wound of shame is actually a driving wound behind all insecure attachment styles. When you have somebody that has an insecure attachment style, especially one that was learned from childhood, you have a person that in some way, shape, or form were not given the love and emotional support they needed as a kid. Maybe it was inconsistent. Maybe it was non-existent. Maybe it was volatile, right? It can create different attachment styles, especially when you factor in this person's temperament. But either way, it's a wound of shame. In some way, shape, or form, you're dealing with a person that personalized that lack of love or the inconsistent love, growing up to feel like they're defective, like they're unlovable, and I am not enough. The I'm not lovable enough wound. And anxious attachers have that wound too, so do avoidant attach. And the really biggest difference is how they react to that wound. The avoidant tries to not face the wound. The anxious attacher tries to get someone else to soothe them to soothe the wound, but it's still the same wound of shame. So shame is a really big component of insecure attachment. And that shame wound can be really difficult for anybody to face.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned that the anxious attached is looking for that validation. There's a difference with how they go about getting it. The avoidant will pull back, the anxious will come in.
Mhm.
Now, give me a few examples, perhaps two solid examples of how an anxious attached person may behave in a relationship when they're looking for that validation and they feel like they're not getting it.
Well, I mean, it often will come in the form of, I mean, really seeking reassurance, but sometimes in a very confrontational or passive aggressive way. Like, why don't you want to spend time with me? I mean, you act like you don't love me, or, you know, um, why do you say this like that? Why can't you say it like this? And it comes across very hostile and confrontational. The anxious attacher is actually looking for the other person to reassure them, no, I do love you. I do mean it this way. I do. But instead, it comes across like they're being attacked. And for an avoidant attached, they're just going to put their guard up and likely shut down because they feel like they're being attacked. So it becomes the push pull there. But it's usually in the form of seeking reassurance, but through maybe not healthy communication, often very passive aggressive, sometimes overtly aggressive ways.
Now, that sounds a lot or resembles covert narcissism.
Sure
The
does.
the guilting, the victim, I'm being wronged. How do we tell the difference between the two?
Well, it can be hard, and this is what I meant. Why I mentioned some narcissistic people can come across as anxious attachers, very controlling, guilting, things like that. Absolutely, it is not just avoidant attachers that can be confused with narcissist, anxious attachers too, or narcissists being confused as anxious attachers. The really big difference is going to really show up in empathy, right? An anxiously attached person, when they are calm, is going to display much more empathy than the narcissist. The narcissist, there's no empathy there. There just isn't any. It's all about them. It is always all about them. And and there are certain distinct behaviors that you'll see from the covert narcissist that you really won't see from an anxious attached. For example, the narcissist will be this wonderful person in public, charismatic. Oh, they're so loving and great. Behind closed doors, they're suddenly a monster to you. The person who's anxious attached is generally going to be consistently the same person in public as they are behind closed doors. It's not like this completely different person shows up in the public square and then suddenly different behind closed doors. The narcissistic person is far more likely to use triangulation as opposed to the anxious attached. Triangulation is using a third party and getting that third party on the side of the narcissistic person to leverage them against their partner to manipulate and control. Um, when there's a divorce involved, for example, the anxious attached is far less likely to try to alienate children against the other parent, whereas the narcissistic parent is very likely to try to alienate the kids from the other parent and demonize the other parent and try to get the kids solely dependent on them, the narcissist. This hurts their other part, well, the ex, which gives them supply, and the kids solely relying on them makes them feel powerful. An avoidant attach or an anxious attach is very unlikely to do that alienation behavior, but a narcissistic person will.
All right, and we talked about the monster that comes up. Now, some of us may tend to think that that monster is a really loud, really aggressive. But what about the little biting comments, the constant biting comments that breaks a person's confidence and self-esteem down? How
Those can
often
be the
does that
worst.
happen? Go on.
Those can be the worst. Yes, by the way, there are narcissistic people that are the grr monster. Those people do exist. And some of them can be abusive in many different ways. But some of the ones that are the hardest to detect are the ones who don't do that. It's the constant biting comments. Like you said, it is the little put downs, the little devaluations. Everything, it gets to the point where you feel like everything you do is wrong. And no matter how hard it is, no matter how hard you try, it is never good enough. And there's an analogy that I heard. It's actually from Sven Erlandson, and it's the best analogy regarding a relationship with a narcissistic person that I've heard. It's the love cup analogy. Imagine you and your partner in a healthy relationship each have a cup. It's a love cup, and you take turns pouring into each other's cup to keep each other filled with love. A narcissistic person has a hole in the bottom of their cup. And no matter how much you pour in, it never fills up. It's never enough. And they're demanding more. It's not enough. It's not good enough. The narcissistic person will find ways to just make you feel terrible about yourself in every capacity. Oh, yeah, your haircut, that doesn't look that good. Why do you do that like that? That doesn't seem very smart. What's wrong with your eyebrows today? Or, if people knew you, they just wouldn't like you. And those little kind of put downs here and there, constantly coming at you, making well, it can't make you, but allowing you to get to the point where you start to feel worthless inside because everything you do is wrong. And it's not like this sudden overnight thing. The narcissistic person starts out love bombing you, and they slowly start to shift into this person that is finding more and more and more and more and more fault with you. It creeps in because if it happened overnight, you wouldn't stick around for it.
All right, and what about the ones who are saying the hurtful things as a joke and saying, "Oh, but I really didn't mean that. I was just being funny." And especially when they do it in public around their friends in
It's
quiet spaces
gaslighting.
they're not doing. All right.
It's gaslighting. That is absolute gaslighting. There's only one reason that a person really ever gaslights another person, and that is to escape accountability. That's it. The gaslighter did or said something that they do not want to be held accountable for. So if they can get you to doubt yourself, to doubt your perception, to doubt your feelings, to doubt your reality, they get to escape accountability. So clearly, they did a put down that wasn't very nice, and you didn't like it. But now, if it was just a joke, well, see, it's not their fault. You're just being sensitive. It's gaslighting. It's just a one of many forms of gaslighting. And that's another distinct difference between a person who is insecurely attached versus a narcissist. Yes, insecure attachers can gaslight. And guess what? Most people throughout their entire lives have gaslit another person. We're all human. We've done it, sometimes even when we don't realize we're doing it. But the level and the degree of gaslighting from a narcissistic person is just far above and beyond what you will ever experience with somebody who is simply insecurely attached. You will, there's actually a physiological impact that a narcissistic relationship will have on the brain. And there's been studies on this. Your cortisol levels, your stress hormone, it can spike to 3 to 400% of that of a normal adult when you're going through all this gaslighting. It's because of the gaslighting, because you feel like you're on eggshells, you're second guessing yourself, you don't know if your own perception of reality is correct. And you're carrying so much anxiety, enough for 3 to 4 adults, that it actually swells the amygdala, which is the lobe of the brain that controls your emotions. It puts you in a fight, flight, or freeze mode, a survival mode. You're in a heightened state of anxiety and you're constantly on edge. Now, back in the day, thousands of years ago, okay, maybe that would have kept you on alert and saved you from a big bear that was trying to eat you. But in modern society, all that does is it tortures you, and you're feeling tortured, you're feeling on edge. The best description of that feeling I can think of is like you feel like there's a sword hanging over your head, and it's just any day that it's just going to fall. There's just this feeling of impending doom, and you can't even put your finger on it, but you feel like it. And it's from all that anxiety. And that level of anxiety is something that is very unique to narcissistic relationships. Of course, there's going to be a lot of anxiety when dealing with an insecure attacher. Absolutely. Not discounting that. But with a narcissistic person, when they are really gaslighting you and you're not sure what you're going through, it's on a whole nother level of its own.
So I'm going to digress just a little bit here because I think it's so important that we start to trust how we feel as a guide, because these nuances between the narcissistic personality disorder and who's got an avoidant attachment style, who's got an anxious attachment style, and how we feel in the relationship is so important. So we may not know the jargon here, the right labels, what exactly they look like. But if we've not studied a textbook, if we don't go to therapy, if we don't have a coach helping us through, we could start to learn to trust how we feel as a guide, right? And I remember when I was faced with anything uncomfortable, my first thought was to hop in the car and go for a drive. Another soothing one for me is long showers. And it took a long time for me to realize that my body knew what to do to move away from stress until I started to learn to self soothe. And now I don't have those thoughts: go for a drive, go for a run, go for a walk, go dancing. What are some other ways people can pick up on their body speaking to them when it's saying, you're not safe right now, you're not feeling safe, and you don't need to stay and figure it out?
Absolutely. Well, one, keep yourself grounded. Absolutely. Take a pause. You're feeling anxiety. Listen to the breeze. Feel the grass underneath your feet. Focus on the wind, the sun, the little things to keep yourself grounded in the moment. And it does have an impact of lowering the internal temperature. And learn to actually trust your gut. Now, your gut is not something to blindly follow. It is your intuition, which is your subconscious. Your subconscious is like a big database, a library of every human experience. And if you have a gut feeling that something is wrong, that something is off, that is your subconscious, that anxiety driven from the subconscious that is trying to warn you. Pay attention to it. It doesn't mean to blindly follow it, but investigate it. Because if you are feeling like that, like you're describing, that's your brain's way of trying to protect you and recognize it's there for a reason. And if you are in a relationship that is only causing you pain, You don't have to stay and figure it out at all. And it doesn't really matter the intention of the other person. If you are being mistreated, you're being mistreated, and you have every right in the world to protect yourself in a healthy way. And recognize that for yourself. You're not obligated to endure pain for anybody.
Can you share a story of perhaps a client who's had a difficult time in letting go of a relationship they were not happy in? And how did you guide them out of it?
Well, I had one. Let me think of one here. Okay, recent one that I had. Not even that recent, maybe some months ago. Guy came out of a marriage, about 30-year marriage. Thought he was getting divorced from somebody who was avoidant. Became pretty apparent over the course of working with them that no, this is somebody who's very narcissistic, and it really it really threw him for a loop. You know, he was so accustomed to second guessing himself, so accustomed to just eagerly scooping up breadcrumbs that he could get and blaming himself for everything. And it was a hard place to be in, and was having a hard time letting go and hard time not blaming himself for the ending of the marriage. She ended up actually leaving him for her personal trainer. I mean, but he was blaming himself for all that kind of stuff. And ultimately, what got him grounded was actually him getting more in touch with what his needs and boundaries actually were in a relationship. Did the deep dive, figuring out what is it that I want? What is it that works for me in a relationship? What doesn't work for me? And not only did he get diligent in what those boundaries are, he got diligent in why he had those boundaries, because it's actually your core values and your core relationship values that inform your boundaries. If something's important to you, there's usually a value behind it. If you value, for example, speaking to each other in a kind way, even when you're mad, well, why? Because you value that kind of kindness and communication, because it's something you value in a relationship. And if you have a partner that screams and calls names every time that you get into a disagreement or a conflict, they're saying, I don't value that kindness and communication the way that you do. So it's important to recognize not only what your limits are, but why you have them. And you get more in touch with that, you really dial him in. He realized, I never have to go through this again because I actually know what my needs are. I know what my wants are. I know what my limits are, and I know why I have them. And I can recognize that when this happens to me again, I will stand up for myself. I'm going to hold the boundary. I'm not going to allow it to happen again. And that actually was what it took for him to let go, because he realized, I've got the key, I've got the answer. It's in within myself and holding my limits and truly respecting what it is that I value.
It sounds like self love is the key here.
Bingo.
Self love. Now, he stayed in that marriage for 30 years.
He did.
What keeps a person in a relationship that is not working for them? Because I'm going to guess that her personality, who she is, didn't just develop overnight. This is something that's been for 30 years. What would keep a person in a relationship for that long? And what happens, I know, we feel that self guilt and we start beating up on ourselves. Why did I stay that long? I should have left. So, how can a person forgive themselves for perhaps not learning to love themselves enough to set those strong boundaries? And why do they stay?
Well, they stay often for shame purposes or guilt purposes, feeling like if I leave this marriage, I'm hurting my children. They need to have a household with both parents. Or it's my fault the marriage failed. It's my fault he or she is acting this way. It's my fault they cheated. It's my fault they're treating me this way. I'm not good enough. So if they were to walk away, it would be kind of almost in their own mind acknowledging them not being enough, acknowledging not being good enough, or failing their children, or failing themselves, having to face the shame and the stigma of a divorce or a breakup. And that right there is fear. It's all fear motivated, and fear is a powerful emotion. And when you're afraid of dealing with something, it's easy to avoid it. And even in certain instances, anxious attached can be avoiders too, avoiding, leaving the relationship, avoiding holding boundaries, because we often tend to avoid what we fear. So that shame, that guilt, that feeling of I'm not enough or I failed, is a tough one for people to face. So often the instinct is, I need to be better, I need to fix this, but it doesn't generally work like that. You have to be able to forgive yourself for not knowing what you didn't know. Because if you knew what you knew now, you wouldn't have stayed. If you had the knowledge that you have now that people that one acquires when they go down the healing journey, the coaching, therapy, reading, watching videos, you're learning things, but you didn't know those things before. And you didn't know that, and there's nothing you can really do to go back in time and change that. You did the best with the tools that you had at the time. You thought you were doing the best, and you have to forgive yourself because you weren't staying with bad intentions. You thought you were doing the right thing, and that's why you need to forgive yourself.
And with that mindset, can we perhaps hold on a little or hold on loosely? Which is, we get married and we think that, or we want the relationship to last forever. We want to find this one person who is our happy ever after. And in that way, perhaps we don't allow ourselves to evolve or accept that they probably would, and that them evolving or them growing may mean that they don't see an alignment with us anymore. Perhaps that would
That
cushion the pain.
it can cushion the pain. It absolutely can. Ultimately, it's important to recognize that you can never control another person. We're all independent, autonomous beings. And no matter how good you are, no matter how wonderful you are as a partner, or how terrible you are, you can't force someone to act in any particular way. You can't force them to work on themselves. You can't force them to do anything. And that's why marriages and relationships are so hard because it truly does take two. No matter how good you are, no matter how much work you put in, someone else can still blow it up. So it does take a lot of work, and it's important to really focus on taking ownership of your side of the street and not taking ownership of the other side of the street. You have to be willing to acknowledge where you can improve, heal, and grow, but recognize that you can't force the other person to do the same. And if their own journey takes them down a different path, you can't control that. When you really come to terms with the fact that you can only control yourself, you can only control the outcome within yourself, that does make it easier to understand that I can't control the path and the journey that this person goes down. It may not be the one I wanted, but at the end of the day, I don't have control over that.
Can you share with us what was that defining moment in your life that made you take up this mantle to learn so much about avoidant attachment, anxious attachment, or attachment theory and narcissism? Was it something personal, a client story?
Personal life experience. I had um, without getting into much detail, I had a long-term relationship with somebody who turned out to be a narcissist. Very difficult experience to come out of. And by the time I was going through that separation, I understood fully what I was dealing with, and there was there was no doubts, and there was people that work in the as psychotherapists and psychologists that know this person that very confident in the narcissism. So I understood what that was, and I didn't want to go through that again. And I wouldn't say that I was ever an extreme anxious attacher, but I didn't really understand any of this stuff, and I certainly did, to a degree, allow myself to become anxious until I didn't. Until I shut down towards the end. I was completely shut down and probably pretty avoidant towards the end because I'd been so flooded with anxiety that my brain started to self-preserve by just shutting down through all the gaslighting and just all I wanted was space. Now, I come out of that first relationship I get into, textbook dismissive avoidant, which just threw me for a loop. And because I knew what a narcissistic person was, but I had no idea about what attachment really even was. So I got blindsided. Everything seemed great, and then I got the "I can't give you what you need" text about 5 months in. And so I was like, okay, I'm not going through this again. I need to figure things out because I knew I wanted something real. I knew I did not want to be this person constantly dating. I was looking for a lifetime partnership. So I went down the rabbit hole and ended up just finding it fascinating. Long after I healed, just the material, the content, it's just so fascinating. I felt like there's more need for voices and understanding in this sphere. And I also have a lot of family members that are things like psychotherapists, psychologists, stuff like that. So I have a lot of kind of background or at least support in that sense. And through my own journey, not just Yeah, with those experiences, but also coaching clients, I was actually able to get to a place in my own personal life where I met my fiance. It's the best relationship I've ever had in my life. Couldn't have dreamed up a better relationship. Her and I, we have real closeness. It's amazing, and it's something that I want other people to experience too. Because when you've only experienced relationships with emotionally unavailable people, you have no idea what the potential could be if you yourself go down that journey and allow yourself to get into a relationship with a person that wants that kind of connection too. It's an entirely different experience.
No, I've got to pry. I was not meaning to pry, but I have to. One of the things that's a real big struggle, and it was for me in my relationship now too, is that when you've gone through so many unhealthy relationship or the patterns in relationships, when you actually get into one that's working, where you feel at peace in yourself, it can get scary. You start to wonder, this is not the normal. And I remember in the beginning of our relationship, I would even find my mind trying to provoke some sort of a uncomfortable scenario in the relationship where he would come in and have to validate me. And I mean, at that point, I was grown enough, emotionally grown enough to stop my mind and say, okay, stop. We don't talk about how difficult it is when we finally get into the relationship we've longed for so long,
Mhm.
and it is
Absolutely.
peaceful and easy. What can a person look for? What happens? What's the thought process that can pop up in our mind? I guess I'm leaning towards, how do we self-sabotage without even realizing it?
We can self-sabotage by, boy, a lot of different ways, really. But I've had to pump the brakes on myself a few times because the relationship is what you've been looking for. And the thought process of, oh my God, I don't want to lose this. I can't lose this. I can't lose this. And then you maybe find yourself looking for extra reassurance in ways that you didn't, or, you know, is everything okay? Is everything okay? Are we good? Are we good? Things like that when everything is clearly fine, and just becoming anxious in a way that perhaps maybe I myself had never been before. So pumping the brakes on that. And sometimes what works for me is I communicate that like, oh, I'm going down my anxious path again. Just communicating that and being open and transparent with that kind of works because we know where each other is coming from. But as a whole, that's really, that kind of stuff really has not been a major factor, but there certainly have been moments because you've experienced so much of what you don't want that your brain becomes trained that, okay, when's that other shoe gonna drop? But it's not. And a lot of that has to come within. You have to be able to soothe and regulate yourself and just trust that what the other person is showing you, especially since they are being consistent, is true because that's how we build trust. When somebody's words consistently match their actions. And when you see that, recognize that that anxiety you're feeling when your partner is truly being consistent is you. And that's got to take ownership of it.
All right, great. I am happy for you. I am truly happy for you. Now, is there a question that I should have asked that I did not ask?
I think it covered them all.
All right. Well, it would be great to have you again in the future.
Love to.
I always love our conversations, and I thank you so very much for being on this with me again and for sharing all of your knowledge and wisdom.
Thank you very much. I love being here and look